Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? And this being Women's History Month, or as I call it, HERstory Month, I am highlighting, as I've done for the previous 2 years as well, 10 women that are doing really phenomenal, cool, interesting things in food and beverage. They're from, I think, 7 different states and 3 different countries. And we're just going to talk to them about what they're doing. And I'm really excited to introduce you today to Jamie Gonzalez, who is also known as the Puta De La Fruta, which translated into English is the fruit whore or fruit bitch. And we're going to talk about that. But Jamie uses her passion and unique moniker to be a voice of strength and empowerment in the industry and her community. She has 15 years of experience in produce distribution and food manufacturing with an emphasis on operations and sales. She is building community through feeding programs such as the Big Fresh Market Box, which we're going to talk about today, the Big State Bodega program, and a series of traveling produce markets that partner with organizations such as the American Heart Association and Common Threads. So, and the one statistic that I put out there to promote this is that since 2020, so in 2 years, just 2 years, Jamie has partnered with more than 50 organizations during the middle of the pandemic or as a result of the pandemic to distribute 3 million pounds of produce, of food. So, Jamie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm excited to be here with you today.
When I found out about you, because I posted it somewhere and a friend of yours forwarded it to me, and I'm like, oh my gosh, she's amazing. So thank you for what you're doing in especially in COVID times of getting food to people in need.
I tell people that I've spent a lot of years either working around food or even longer growing up around food families. And so I had a lot of food privilege, but it was COVID that was really able to ignite some of the work that I had done previously and use it as a catalyst to create some longer change that was already needed prior to COVID as well. And it really gave that work a voice.
Well, and that's fantastic because, people need to know, you've been in or in the food business since you were like 10 and 14 or yes. Around it. And when you were around it is that what you wanted to be?
No,
work in the food industry from that?
I had no idea. I'm 45. And we grew up in that generation of where we were still told that, especially down in the southern part of Texas, and being Hispanic, doctor, lawyer, architect, those were the things that we were supposed to be. And so I had aspirations of being in the medical field for a number of years, actually. And when I was working in food, when I was younger and I was around it, there's this same narrative that we have today where the idea of working in the food industry in some way is like a punishment, that somehow we didn't do enough or that we didn't study hard enough and that we were going to end up working in food. And for not my parents' fault, that was the narrative for them too. But it was, if you don't do well, you're going to fry French fries your whole life. And later I chose to sell potatoes on purpose. So it changed for me over the years. And when I was 19, I actually got my first job working in a produce company. And it was with the same man that introduced me to certain things when I was 10 years old. And so it was at that point when I started to really realize it. It took a number of years after that to know that was my passion.
Well, and that's interesting because I was chatting with some people yesterday as well, and actually, and their families were the same thing. They're both Black and they grew up in the South, and they're like, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a lawyer, the aspirations. And like food is a bad, I guess we look at it when we see fast food chains and things like that, that's what it relates to. But there's so much more to food.
There is. There really is. I mean, from the seed to the table, it takes a great number of people to not just get your food to your table, but to tables all over the country, school tables, hospital tables, entertainment tables, and all of those things in between it. But there are a number of jobs to be had in the food distribution industry that aren't just in a traditional kitchen.
And we need to value those, because even like farmers, right? I mean, I think the value of farmers has progressed a lot in the last decade or two, but it's still not valued as much as it probably should be.
That's correct. No, absolutely. And then when we look at the scale and the size of farms, we want to encourage people to farm, and we're losing farmers at a rate that's greater today than it's ever been, because we're not encouraging the small local farmer. And there are things to be changed in like the farm bill that would allow more independent farming and protection for those farmers, so that we shrink the size of big ag and use it in the ways that we need it, but also encourage sustainability at a local level by encouraging people to grow and being able to feed their community.
Well, and how did COVID help you do that some? I'm assuming that it did. It allowed you to connect directly to some of the smaller farmers, because we all saw on the news farmers were throwing potatoes away and pouring out milk and things like that. Did COVID really help shine a light on that? Or is it still, I mean, there's still change that has to be made?
I think there's change that has to be made still. It also, it affects us geographically. A lot of the videos that you saw of people just plowing over fields and losing their potatoes, where the potato loss has been just catastrophic. And because there was so much less processing of potato. And that's what we don't realize, is that in that produce that we're pulling and using for our grocery stores or for our restaurants, there is a whole layer of produce that's being used in food manufacturing in this country. Okay. And we need that produce so that we do have the ability to feed on large scale. In Texas, and especially in the southern part of Texas, a lot of our farmland is leased out by large retailers already. And so that food had a place to go. Yeah. And so we have one of the greatest grocery store chains here in South Texas, and they are able to control a lot of that produce and keep our produce costs and a lot of our food costs much lower than other places are in the country. And so and it's a double-edged sword. It's amazing to have that, but there is a lack of knowledge and understanding of the true cost of food sometimes. It did connect to more local farmers, and it did get some of that food into the hands of the food bank or into our food boxes and into produce markets all over Texas. And so we saw a lot of that here. We didn't see as much devastation of crop loss as we did in other places. What did affect us, though, was like in Texas, it was COVID and then the freeze that following year. And so because of that, because of that, it's going to take years for us to see normal levels of things like Texas citrus be back to where they were pre-COVID, not just because of not having enough people to pick, but because of the devastating crop loss due to the weather. Because
trees have to grow.
Yeah.
And they don't grow that. Exactly.
No, they don't. No, they sure don't.
So what ways you had a stint in healthcare? You mentioned that as well. And then your passion for food. How did that bring you back to what you're doing now?
So when I had my daughter in 2003, she led me into this, I would say. I needed better health benefits at one point. And so I ended up in healthcare a few years later, actually, when I had my son. And it was interesting. My kids at the time, who were much younger then, they would go to my parents' house after school every day. And my father started working in the produce industry a year after I did. He just never left for a little while. And so I've had the benefit of being able to work very closely with my family over the years. And so my dad still worked in produce, and I would come pick up my children every day, and he would ask me questions because we're salespeople, we're business people, him and I, and we speak the same sales language. And so I was always following along. The company that my father worked for is Big State Produce. He still works there. I still work there. And that company is owned by the Mendes family, who have been part of my life and part of my family basically since I was 8 years old. They taught me what produce was. And so I would go home every day and I would talk to my father about it. And And I knew I loved food. I always loved to cook. I grew around people that cooked. My mother's a professional baker in her off time. My grandfather, my father's father, was also a professional baker. And I don't bake. Please don't ever ask me to bake anything. But so we grew up about food and cooking. And I paid attention to my tios and them when they would cook outside. And I like meat. I like produce. So that was going on. There were, in that part of the Mendez family, there's 4 children. The oldest daughter, Ann Mendez, and I, we started going to school together when we were 8 years old in the 3rd grade. So that's how we met. And when I was younger, working for the family in both of their companies, there was not really a next generation of Mendez at the time that was interested in carrying on the family tradition. And at this point, this was already a 2nd generation produce company. The family itself has been in produce in San Antonio for nearly 100 years. And so,
wow.
Yeah. And one of the Mendez daughters, the youngest daughter of Ron Mendez, she decided, first of all of the children, that she actually wanted to pursue this line of work as well. They all worked there. They've all worked there at times, and they just had. And I was so excited about that. And I was in a place in healthcare where I was doing really great work. I was very successful. I traveled nationally as a Social Security representative for a 3rd-party organization that is in the healthcare, in hospitals. And we would screen people for assistance and benefits. And I specialized in Social Security. My husband was worried that Social Security was going to knock on the door and be like, "Stop it, Jamie." So, it's not an easy job. It's a soul-sucking job at times. It's sad. These people are sick. These people are dying. I officed, even though I traveled for them nationally, I officed out of the Children's Hospital of San Antonio here in downtown San Antonio. And in the first 3 months that we were there, they announced that they were going to change this hospital that had always serviced children and adults and make it a children's only hospital. It was needed. It's a beautiful hospital. But one of the reasons they had to make the choice to do that, and one of the things that led me back to food later, was because of the amount of charitable assistance that they had to give to the homeless adults and the people who had no funding. And there was a lot of other hospitals in the area that they felt could support it. And I thought, wow, here's a charitable organization that's having to make decisions with their money on how many children can they help versus adults and children. And these adults are repeaters. And there's this whole, and we talked about people like if they were apples, like if they were inventory. And I spent another 5 years doing that. But I always had that moment. And as the children would come in and their families would come in, and then so many of the times that we would see that a lot of this was related to the inequity in the healthcare system, and the inequity in our food system and food insecurity. Mm-hmm. When I knew that Karen wanted to go back to Big State, I knew I wanted to go back there too. And so a year later, I ended up back in the produce industry. And it was with the mindset that even though I'd spent my early years in produce before I took a break, working in the office, working in the warehouses, learning to sell to well-known chefs and buying high-end cheeses and all things I still do today, but that I wanted to come back and work with programming that was specifically feeding the community in a variety of ways. And one of those was to come back and support Big State in their sales of produce and milk to a company called Rico Services, who at that time had, and still does though, but had a significant amount of the summer nutritional feeding program here. And that is the free lunch program that everybody receives. And it's broken up in different organizations now. But when I was 14, my very first job was counting apples, oranges, and bananas and milks for Rico.
Wow.
And so 30 years later, there I was and still am counting apples, oranges, and bananas for people.
Thank you for that from when you were 14 and now. It's so important, and we take for granted, and you said it a little bit earlier, of what we can put on our table and what kind of food we can put on our table as well. Right. And I think designing programs that help get into the communities. And your traveling produce market, there's one in Atlanta that I know that was partnering with MARTA, the train system in Metro Atlanta, to put some of the produce markets near those stations because some of those people can't get to where the farmers markets are.
That's the goal too, is to bring the food into places where normally maybe it's not there, but people are accessing it, or to bring it to people in ways that where they're not able to get to it at times because of our lifestyle.
Exactly. And if you rely on public transportation or something and you actually and are working and you can't get there and the market's closed, that's a big hindrance for sure. So you've got some fans here. Jessica from the American Heart Association says hello. And then Sabrina as well, Sabrina Scott. So thank you both for being here. Since you started the programs, and actually let's go back to your moniker, the Puta De La Fruta, the fruit whore, the fruit bitch. And before we got online, you were talking about, and I told you that my niece just loved the name, and she's 21 and she's just like, more power to you. So kudos to you from her. But you were telling me about how in your own family, who loves it and who doesn't love it.
Absolutely. So my daughter, this started because I tried to make a point to my daughter and my son that I could basically call myself anything that I wanted as irreverently as I wanted to and put a hashtag on it. And that people would start to listen to me differently and look at me differently, because that is the world that we live in now. And that I could leverage that to be taken more seriously. And when I say taken more seriously, as a woman in the food industry, like specifically as a woman in the food industry, I've done very well overall. I've been successful overall in a lot of the things that I've done in food, but I wasn't always understood. And I wasn't always, and women in this industry didn't always have the voice that we're growing into right now. I was the office girl for years. I'm Jamie Gonzalez. I live in San Antonio. I get called Jaime Gonzalez every day. So most people expect to see a man. They do. And sometimes I play into it. I'm like, no, I don't know that guy, but he's a jerk. And so there was that whole element of it. And we have these words that we use down here and that we've used in different ways over the years. But I told them that I was going to call myself the Puta De La Fruta. And it changed the tone of the room every time I walked into a room after that. Every time I posted something on social media, you get this, oh my gosh. And then they're just like, oh my gosh. I was at a benefit once and a very well-known local chef was introducing me to his wife. And I introduced myself. My husband was with me. And he goes, they also know her as the Puta De La Fruta. And she spit her drink on him. And I was all, it's affectionate. Like, it's an affectionate thing. My father used to absolutely, Jamie, why do you call yourself that? It's so terrible. And I blame my grandmother for helping raise me this way. But I told him, I was like, if it bothers people to a certain extent, then it takes some of the out of it, and I can use it forever, whatever I want. I'm not the generic girl. I'm not that produce lady, even though I'm the produce lady. And in this industry, there is a lot of that. And growing up in the industry and doing all the different jobs and making deliveries and working in the warehouse with being the office girl, I wanted to carve my own identity for myself. And to do that and to let people know that there are strong women working in food, and we do a lot of vital jobs in connecting people with food. And the other part is that there's a very common preconception that women in sales are a certain way. And whether or not I'm that way, calling yourself that, it makes a lot of men stop sexually harassing you. It's almost intimidating. And I appreciate and enjoy that every moment that it happens. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
So I've used it in a lot of ways, and I've gotten to work with a lot of chefs over the years. Some of them, they'll tell me, they're like, I cannot call you that. Good. I'm okay with that too. You don't have to call me that, but it's really... it's probably been about 5 years or so that this has been going on and really grown. And there was a period of time that I did not feel like the Puta De La Fruta. And then there was a time where I realized that I still was. So.
Well, I'm glad that you realized that you still were, because it's an important role that you have. So let's talk about you have two mantras. So that's your moniker, but you also have two mantras. Mm-hmm. And I really want to touch and get back into the women's in this industry as well. But your mantras are that everybody eats, which I say all the time, and cultivating community. So how do those two work together, and especially with what you're doing? So the everybody eats also comes from the fact that I'm a mom and a reader, but there's this very popular book called Everybody Poops. And yes.
And everybody poops, right? Not if they don't eat. And so before they can do that, they have to eat. Everybody eats. Everybody deserves to eat. We all deserve the same access to food. And before I really understood how to have that conversation and use those words in the right way. I'll also tell you that everybody eats in the sense that I tend to have more job stability than most people in this country. Everybody eats. They never stop eating. They eat for a variety of reasons. They eat in a variety of ways. And a lot of times it's understanding how the changing face of food is affecting us nationally and in our local community, and how we're tying into that to do the business of feeding people. And sometimes it looks like a 5-star restaurant. Sometimes it does. And sometimes it looks like me feeding somebody in a cafeteria, or it looks like me putting a box of produce on somebody's doorstep.
And there's so much in that. There's so much opportunity. There's so much pain as well in that. Because you've got Meals on Wheels programs and getting food to senior citizens, and then getting kids to the school program, food to the kids in the school program. And even with COVID, I don't even remember the statistic, but I know that so many more people have had to visit the food banks. They never thought they ever would have had to visit a food bank. And COVID has changed that.
And that's really where that cultivating community aspect comes into it. I was raised with a strong sense of community. There was this, and some of it's just, I think it's just who I am. And other parts of it are what I grew up around and experiencing, not necessarily somebody telling me, you have to do this. I was always the first kid that was going to stand up and challenge the teacher because we weren't being treated fairly, stuff like that. All good things. But as I got older and I experienced life and it kicked me around a lot and stuff, I was told often, you need to find a hobby, Jamie. You need a new hobby, and you need to relax. You need a hobby. And I thought, okay, maybe I should learn to play golf or darts or any of these things, or maybe I should make crafts. And I've tried a lot of things over the years. But when COVID, this moment happened. So when I was younger, like I said, I was always the volunteer. And so I was in the first couple of rounds of AmeriCorps. I was the teen of the year for District 1 in San Antonio in 1995 because of the amount of service that I gave. And I graduated with more service hours in my high school than anyone ever has. You had to graduate with 400. I had over 3,000. But I also sold hours to kids. So I was not the best kid. I was selling my hours on the side and stuff. And so I wasn't always the best kid, but I had well-intentioned. I spent many years volunteering at a summer camp for children with special needs, year-round actually, called Children's Association for Maximum Potential, or camp. Some of my greatest heroes were founders of that camp. And so all of that was always in me. And then I had children and we went to have them in school, and I became the volunteer lady mom. We're like, you were going to serve, you were going to work the festival, you're going to do all those things. And then my career really takes over that. When COVID happened, there was not only an opportunity to find creative ways to sell produce in the community, because when I feed you, I feed myself, in order to help our company survive in a time where we lost 80% of our business overnight. But also on a personal level, it reignited my understanding and my passion of wanting to connect my community with each other and with the resources that we have that we can share with each other. And so when we do things like our traveling produce markets, which is a really good example of this, we work both sides of the table. We want you to come and shop at those markets for a number of reasons, but we also look for volunteers to help at those markets for a variety of reasons. You stand on the other side of the table and you're serving your community. You're connecting them with food. You're having experiences with food with each other. And you're also learning about produce that you had no idea was there before you walked in that day, probably. And we're inspiring people to spend an hour or two with us at a produce table, because we hope that it encourages them to spend an hour or two doing something else in the community that they love. And that could be planting trees in the new food forest that we're building here, or, or reading to kids, or holding babies in a NICU, and all of the other things that we do to support our community. When we work together as organizations and businesses in private-public partnerships, we are cultivating community, because we are growing not only like the resiliency of the people in our community, but economic stability for each other as well.
Wow. That there's so much in that as well. But one of the statements that I love that you said was that when I feed you, I feed myself as well. And I think that's really important because, and I'm giving a session in this room later on today on food, purpose-driven food. And food should be purpose-driven at all times because it's, like you said, everybody eats, but there's so many jobs around food that we take for the servers who serve us, the cook, the line cooks in the back of the house, the guy, the person who drives the truck from the from the farm to the convention center, et cetera. But we don't think about all that. And when we do, we think about the community of how that actually got to our plate. So you mentioned your grandmother and you mentioned your father. So any words of wisdom that they have given you through the years in doing what you're doing now?
I knew that you might ask me this. And so I was really thinking about it. I don't come from a family of advice givers like that, where I could tell you that I had these moments where like my dad sat me down and he was like, Jamie, do this. A lot of that comes from, but they're people of action and they're people of passion. And I come from that and I know that. And so my mother had a regular full-time job with amazing benefits for us when we were kids, and also ran her own cake business out of our house for 45 years now. She rarely bakes for us. And so it's a lot of that and that determination and also their passion for community. And they see community maybe on a smaller scale than I do, but that's where that came from and grew. My grandmother, though, my grandma Carmen Puentes, which is my mom's mom, she gave me some sage wisdom over the years. We had a very special relationship. And she used to work as a bookkeeper for a furniture company here in San Antonio. She never drove. She was from a generation of women that never ever drove. None of her sisters ever drove either. And I asked her once, I was like, what are you going to do if grandpa dies? And she goes, I'll learn to drive, mija. She was 80. She was already 80 at that point. So she would have been fine. She went back to school though, or she went to school and got a teaching degree at San Antonio College before I was born, just a few years before I was born. And she used to ride the bus there every night after work to go.
Wow.
And so truly an inspiration. Also a very not appropriate woman. And I loved her for that. And all the bad words I knew in English and Spanish, she taught me playing Scrabble when I was a kid with her. And she told me a few things over the years that always stuck with me. And the first one she told me, or the first set, it came when I had an understanding of it from her, but watching her over the years. But when her and my grandfather got older, my grandfather was a wonderful man. So please don't take the story the wrong way. But as they got older, they went to the same doctors. That was part of their life too. You go to the doctor when you get older all the time. And my grandmother told me, she goes, Mia, today when I went to the doctor, he asked me if your grandfather ever hit me. And she goes, I don't think he thought that, but they have to ask those kind of questions now. She's all, and it's so weird because of how I grew up. And she goes, and I told him, no, my husband has never hit me. So because I followed the advice that my mother gave me, my great grandmother. Okay. So you always keep a cast iron skillet in your kitchen. Now, a lot of us would always keep a cast iron skillet in our kitchen because of the health benefits of using cast iron and the things we love about it. Right. My grandma also wanted me to know that if you had a cast iron skillet, you could hit that man upside the head and he would never hit you again. And she told me that. She was like, I don't know if you know this, Miha, but when your grandfather and I were younger, it was very fashionable to hit your wife sometimes. And she goes, and your grandfather never did that to me. Also, he would have never done that. Your grandfather never did that to me. But I know I always had a cast iron skillet in my house. She also told me to always hide money. And she did. She goes, you always hide money because the women in the home are the ones that keep it together when it really falls apart. When she passed away, we found over $15,000 hidden in her house. Not wealthy people. They lived in 700 square foot home. But my grandfather would fix the house up for my grandfather. And she books under things I knew to look because she always told me. And the other thing that she imparted on me from a very young age, and I'm going to curse on your show because she was an irreverent woman, fine. But she told me, she goes, Mia, not everybody's going to like. And I was younger and I remember being upset at the time because a group of girls didn't like me. And she goes, not everyone is going to like you. And you know what I say to that? And I go, what? She goes, fuck them. And that was my grandmother. That was my grandmother. That lady smoked in front of her kitchen window and cooked the best food. And if somebody didn't like her, fuck them. And so I've tried to do that over the years. Wow.
I mean, it takes a decorum to do that, but it is that, like, you just have to keep trudging away. And I think she would be so proud of you, because I think you are.
I appreciate that. I like to think she's proud of me too.
So what, have you had any dark times in your life that have actually helped fuel you even more? I mean, I'm sure that, like, your grandmother's passing would be something very sad, but anything else that has helped you really say, I'm going to get this done?
Yeah. So you have to know, since we don't know each other very well yet, Tracy, that I've almost died probably 5 times. And generally at my own hand. Like, it's a thing. When I was in the 5th grade, the teachers had a meeting with my parents, and they said that they should put me in a bubble. I was voted most likely to fall down in high school. And I still talk to the people who voted for me like that. Yes. Oh no, I'll make an entrance every single time. And I've been very sick at times, and I've been injured at times. But in 2017, I started my own business. I left Big State for a while, and I started my own produce company with some very great ideas for it. And it was called the Chop Shop. And about almost a year and a half in, I sustained a almost life-ending injury, and I broke my neck. And I have a really cool story about how I broke my neck. I woke up one day in pain. I couldn't move. I was in what I thought the best shape of my life. I was carrying about 5,000 pounds on my back every day. I was working in my warehouse. I did all of those things. And we didn't know the extent of the injury until they did the surgery. But I remember I was laying there, and this all happened in 6 weeks. I woke up one day in pain, and 6 weeks later, I had to have emergency surgery. And in that time, I lost the use of my right arm and my right hand. I lost at that time almost all the use of my left leg. It was bad. And I told my husband and my business partner and best friend at the time, it's still my best friend, but my business partner at the time, I told them both, I was like, I think I'm dying. And they're like, Jamie, come on, like, don't be dramatic. I was like, no, I really do. I think I'm dying. And I was trying everything to get better. They were like, it's muscle tension. It's this, it's that. And I was going to like a sports therapy clinic, and they were like, look, you're not getting better. You got to get an MRI. And 48 hours later, I was in a neurosurgeon's office. And that man told me, He shows us the pictures, and he's, look, we have to do this. If we don't do the surgery in the next 30 days, you'll never walk again. And if we don't do the surgery at all, I'm going to give you less than a year to live. And I looked at my husband, and I go, that man just said I'm dying. And I felt vindicated, and I was terrified at the same time. And they did the surgery on August the 21st, 2018 is when they did the surgery. It was the first day of my daughter's freshman year. It was the first time I didn't take my children to school on their first day of school. And I cried and cried because of it. After that, I told myself I was going to cry today. After that, we had to shut down our business. I lost my business. I lost my home. I lost everything financially. I almost lost my family. And I was the darkest time of my life. And I've been very honest about that over the years. Even when I was struggling, it took a while. And at that time, my company was helping make salsa for what is now a very large salsa manufacturer. And I still, best salsa ever, eat Cocina Fresca salsa. But I was able to go and work with them in their offices for a year and help them do some great stuff and develop new flavors and gain new distribution, and know that I could still do the work and get my mojo back. And I had this year of, I don't know where my mojo is. I don't feel it. I was not the Puta De La Fruta. And so I finally mourned the loss of myself and what I thought I was supposed to be. And so at the end of that year, which was at the end of 2019, I had accomplished all of the things they'd asked me to accomplish with them for that year. And I said, I'm done making salsa. And we were done making salsa together. And I came back to be the produce lady again and to be the puta. When I did that, I was supposed to help open restaurants with some chefs. And then COVID hit and everything shut down. And so when everybody felt even more not that I wasn't overwhelmed or haven't been overwhelmed by COVID, but there's been this sense of anxiety and fear because of COVID and that sense of loss that many of us had. I have a really good friend who's a chef. His name is James Cantor. And when Hurricane Harvey hit, this man stayed in Victoria, Texas with his business, with his food truck, and just kept feeding people. He just kept feeding them. He was like, that's all I know what to do right now. And stories have been told about him. I couldn't go. I had my shop open. I sent produce. Chefs went there. They did all of these things. And I'd known him indirectly for a number of years. But from those moments grew a very deep friendship with this man and a great working relationship with him. And when COVID hit, people expected him to know what to do. They were like, what is James Cantor going to do? How are you going to help everybody? What are you going to do? And he was like, Jamie, I don't know what to do, because it was different than a hurricane for him. Mm-hmm. And I had just spent over a year at that point trying to heal from what I went through. I was isolated. I was scared. I was cut off from everyone. Financially, I had been devastated. And so in that moment, I was like, we got this shit. It's going to be okay. Be scared for right now. Do those things. And that time I started feeding people. And he was always an encourager of that. And it really taught me something about not just myself, but about how we perceive people and what they do in moments, and then what our expectations of our expectations are of them long term. And we put things on people, and then we put those things on ourselves, and we'll struggle in those moments. And everybody struggles. It's okay to struggle, but from those struggles, great things can be born.
That's an amazing story, and it's. Yeah, we do grow from them. And actually in a conversation last night, I'm like, from something that I did 12 years ago, and I didn't look at food and beverage from different perspectives. And they're like, but that's okay, because that's where you were now, where you were then. And now this is where you are. And you learn from every single one of those things through the community that you have and the people that support you. Yeah. So I commend that. That's really great. How do you want to be remembered in history?
Oh, fondly, the occasional villain, probably. I would like to be an example of what exists between the farm and the chef coat, honestly, in that way, as somebody that was not afraid to stand up for what she believed in, and to know when to say that maybe she didn't make all the right choices at times as well. I want to be known for my honesty and for my passion for community and my love of my work. And I would like for people to think that I'm funny, because that's important to me for some reason. But I want to be able to say that I was a strong woman with the other women that we believe are strong in history.
I think that's something to be very proud of. Now, there was a story. I want to get back to this, because we were talking about, just before we came online, and I almost forgot to ask you, we were talking about the money melon, which you learned about when you were younger. But then you had, and I questioned it, because I'm like, okay, melons. And it's something in the event industry that we use a lot on continental breakfast, on any kind of breakfast. But to me, I feel like it gets thrown away a lot as well. But then you had a story about broccoli you were going to tell me.
So when I was 10 years old, I was at a softball party. And Roy Mendez, who I call my second father, I call them my two dads, honestly. But Roy Mendez was my softball coach. He was also a lot of other things to me over the years, but he showed up at this party with this big bowl of cut up fruit. And there was these green chunks in it. And I was like, what is that? And he goes, Jamie, it's honeydew. It's the money melon. And this was about 1987 or so. And honeydew was becoming very popular back then. But I knew what he meant. And it was exactly like what you were saying. There was a lot of, it's expensive, it's hoity-toity. People think it looks cool, but they also tend to think that it's fairly flavorless, and it's the thing that gets left there all the time. It becomes one of the most wasteful pieces of produce on the table. Because if we didn't eat it and we threw it away, we wasted it, right? There was that many more people that could have eaten it, or we could have used for different reasons, or we could grow more of something else and less honeydew if we all said, hey, we mostly use this for garnish. And is that really sustainable? The Honeydew Commission is going to hate me after saying that, but it's the honeydew. I have Dino melons right now, and Dino melons are like the sweetest melon, and it's a cousin of the honeydew. It's a white flesh melon. And people look at it and they're like, it looks like a honeydew. I was like, I promise it has more flavor than that for you. So, but later, when I got older and I started to think about that, that's that first moment for me as somebody who not just likes community, but also likes to sell and make money. I was just like, wait, it's the money melon? Like I've brokered $30,000 truckloads of tomatoes at this point, but money melon stuck with me longer than that. And so later when I started talking about food waste with people and how to be better consumers and how to get more out of what we're bringing into our home. And in that, not just save money, but use our money more wisely when we buy our food and become more sustainable. Sustainability and food waste isn't always how are we throwing it away? Are we putting it in the right container? Are we composting? Are we doing all important things? But it also starts at, are we overbuying? Are we buying things that we're truly going to eat? Are we buying things that we think we're supposed to eat because somebody always told us to, or because that's what we just understood? And we pass up things in stores that we don't know what to do with. We have a great set of grocery stores here in San Antonio, but I equate going to the grocery store and shopping in the produce department like going into the Home Depot and really wanting to have a conversation about the variety of woods that are in there. They're not really going to know it's okay, but they don't. And sometimes we don't expand our palate because of those things. And so, I have a lot of food privilege. I grew up with a lot of food privilege. There was a lot of food around us all the time. And there was the money melon was just coming to my house sometimes. And so I don't like broccoli. That's what I was telling you before we started. I'm not a big fan of broccoli. I'm just not. It's a texture. I'm just not. And some people are, and they think I'm crazy, but I would consistently buy broccoli. I would buy it fresh. I would buy it frozen. I would buy it always. And then I would consistently throw almost all of it away. Or I'd find that bag in the back of my freezer because flash frozen broccoli it's a smart way to do broccoli. But I find it in the back of my freezer in a ball of ice. And I'm like, I didn't eat the broccoli again. We didn't eat the broccoli again. But I had asparagus around me a lot. And I had asparagus around me a lot at one point when my children were younger, so a few years ago, because of the way that food waste works in this country. Okay. So when we roll a truck up to the back of a grocery store, whether it's a Walmart or a Kroger or an HEB, not all of that food is accepted at the dock. And it's not accepted for a variety of reasons. And it can be rejected because it was like the PLU isn't on there, or the sizing was missized, or any number of reasons. And historically, that food would have rolled away and gone into a dump, and nobody would have ever touched it. Over the last 10 years, there's been a growth of this other concept where those trucks will roll over to a company very similar to Big State Produce, and we will rework that produce. Okay. So this is an amazing example. Asparagus gets stacked into a truck, and while it's riding all across the country to get to HEB, two of the pallets tip, and they're like wonky in the truck, and it's going to take a lot of work to get it out. And the grocer that's receiving this says, I'm not going to take that way. I'm not going to do that. We're not paying for that. Get it out of here. Okay. But maybe you should send it somewhere to get it reworked. And they send it to somebody like us. So instead of it getting thrown away because somebody doesn't know how to wrap a pallet the right way, possibly, it would come to us. We would offload it, restack, repalletize, get a new count, take that product back to an HEB, and they'll receive it, and they will now sell you the asparagus that needs to look number one quality all the time because of marketing, which is a totally different conversation. And what was left over of it stays with a company like mine, where we sell it in the open market to restaurants and caterers, or I put it in produce boxes or at produce markets, and we're using it. And that allows us to extend the number of ways that we use it. Right now, it's that piece isn't just going into the restaurant, and it's also going into this other part of the consumer, not because it's left over and we don't want it, but because it's more sustainable and we're throwing less away because we're creating accessibility for people. And so because of this, I had a lot of broken asparagus, and I started bringing it home, and I realized that I liked asparagus, and that I didn't just have to cook it the way that everybody says to cook it, which isn't the best way, and that I could chop pieces of it and eat it raw, like on a platter with ranch, and my kids would eat it. And now I'm less afraid to spend maybe 50 cents more on a pound of asparagus at the store than I am broccoli, because I ate the asparagus and I threw away the broccoli. So the broccoli didn't save me money. It cost me more money, and I created more waste. And that food wasn't available as somebody else. And so that all comes from having that moment.
I love that story.
Yeah.
Wow. That is just such a full circle story on why we don't like foods and what happens to that food, because we all have food that goes bad in our refrigerators, and even potatoes that get the little things on them because we haven't used them fast enough. Right. And I don't even know what those things are called, but I love that. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing the back of the house of the grocery store too, because I think we take that for granted. And in my session today, I'm going to talk about how 30 to 40% of our food is wasted. Mm-hmm. And meeting planners in the US, and this is pre-COVID, spent about $54 billion a year on food and beverage. And if 40%, that's $20 billion of food that's gone to waste. And probably more than half of that is already put out, and they can't do anything. They can't repackage it to send it back.
And then when we talk about the amount of food that's left on the farms, it's a significant amount. Those are changes to the farm bill as well. If an apple hits the ground, we're not supposed to sell it. But when we look at, I find the concept of ugly produce very interesting. And for a lot of reasons. 5 years ago, I would have told you the grocery stores need to change that and change how they're marketing. And they do. Marketing is the number one reason or the number one encourager of wastefulness, and not understanding how some of our food should look a little more natural than it does, or that it's not always going to be the exact same size and shape. However, there are a lot of companies that have grown into something else because of the ugly produce movement. They all do good work. It's not that they're not doing good work, but there's this like mayday call of, we're wasting so much because it's not pretty enough, and we're saving it all by putting it in this box for you. And I love a box of produce, don't get me wrong. But there is a key component that's missing here that we don't tell in the narrative, which is food manufacturing accounts for a large percentage of the produce that we are using in this country in a variety of ways. And a lot of what we say is the ugly produce that would have just been thrown away in like those commercials that we see. It's actually the B grade produce that does have a home, and that is used for juicing. It's used for, and so if we're going to tell this, if we're going to create the narrative, we have to create the totality of that narrative. There's so much more that is wasted, and that is so true. But because I also have that manufacturing background and the fresh chopping of produce, the people ask us all the time. They're like, what do you do with your waste? Can you, I've been asked by people to take the waste and turn it into salads for prisoners. Okay. As a food manufacturer, as a food processor, if I was creating that much waste, I would not be successful. So there's a lack of a connection and understanding of what that manufacturing actually looks like and how much waste is actually being created. It's like donating to a food bank. Okay. We're big donors to the San Antonio Food Bank. They're also one of our number one customers. We sell a lot of produce to them for a variety of reasons as well. But when we look at the amount of food that we're donating, and I used to be on their development board for a couple of years. And when we had this one, Amazon was just coming into town and they were just starting to sell fresh foods here. They had not acquired Whole Foods yet. And they were sending a lot of food to the food bank. And everybody was very excited. And I give it 2 years. I'm going to give it 2 years and it's going to dial down at least a little bit. Because if we are sending that much food out of our warehouses into the food bank, that means we're not being good buyers. And that's indicative of being wasteful of food. I'm also losing money then. It's great to give. I want to give to you. But if I'm having to give you like truckloads a week and stuff like that, I'm probably internally, our business is not strong and it's failing. And so even though we should give and we want to give, we have to manage the amount that we need to give by being smart buyers. And that goes into our homes too. If we are buying too much, like we'll go to farmers markets. Farmers markets are a big thing. And inherently you go to the farmers market, you want to buy everything. And then you go home and you throw all of it away because it sat on your counter. Partly because you didn't know where to put it when you got it home. That type of produce that comes from farms like that are smaller farms, they may not have had the benefit of the field heat being taken out of them. You as a consumer don't know that probably or understand what that does to the longevity of your produce. And so that's part of it. But then also we sometimes as a society promote the overconsumption and buying of food. like in food distributions and those types of things where that mentality is like, we need enough, like we need more. I don't encourage people to buy 30 or 40 pounds of produce from me at any given time. You don't need that much produce. There's no way, unless you're a vegan, like there's no way. And so even with the produce boxes, I want you to buy it once or twice a month at the farmer's market. I mean, at my produce market, the average person is spending about $10 to $15. They're getting about 12 to 15 pounds of produce. That is normal. That is a sustainable amount. That's supposed to encourage people not to feel the need to hoard, but also how to use their produce better. Let's get you out there and rotating it out more when we can. There's so many layers to why that's a better practice for us, not just in our businesses, but in our homes as well.
Wow. I mean, now I'm going to, because I overbuy at the farmer's market for sure. And definitely. So but it also, everything that you said can completely apply to meeting planners and the need to make sure that our chafing dishes are full and over ordering and even because even our catering partners always make 3% over what we order. Right. So you need to take that into consideration, but it's also knowing your numbers and knowing the food history and asking people, are you coming to this food function? Or maybe, hey, you're in town and I'm going to go see Jamie instead of going to the opening reception. Figuring those things out are really important so that we aren't overbuyers.
When I work with event planners and caterers and chefs that do these types of events, and even as I've worked more and more with like large food service companies because I've been doing this with them for a very long time, that understanding of what does a portion look like? How much does that weigh? I encourage people who plan events and who are buying for parties and things like that to work closely with your purveyor. Ask the questions. Your purveyor should know how to answer those questions for you. If you know that you're going to do a basic 4-part salad and you're going to have 250 people there, whether or not it has a couple of grape tomatoes on top of it, the salad portion alone, I, as the person that you purvey it from, should be able to help guide you in the quantity of food that's responsible for you to buy and help answer those questions for you. And when we bid on contracts, like when we're bidding on parties, if you have purveyors that you work with all the time, reach out to them in your bid process. It's something that I look at also when we feed people like on Meals on Wheels type feeding, or when we have our pre-K contracts here in San Antonio, or like senior feeding programs, feeding in the jails and doing conventions and stuff. If you put a bid out and you win that bid and you never spoke to the people that you buy from about the cost, you just do that on, I know, you're going to get yourself in trouble over time. You will. And you'll start to lose bids, or you're going to realize that you're not actually making the money that you want to be making. And it's having a good relationship with your vendors or key vendors that you train each other in that. I've learned so much from a variety of event planners and chefs over the years that I use that knowledge to make me smarter at how I try to buy produce and how I build like my boxes for the community as well. Wow.
Well, thank you for that education, because we all do need to do it. And it just depends on where you are as well, you know, who those partners are. But it's definitely asking more questions. And you and I could talk for hours more. I know we could, but we are approaching an hour now. So I have one final question. I did ask you how you wanted to be remembered in history, and I love it. What's your favorite food to eat? We know broccoli's not it, but what is your favorite food?
Not. When we talk, people laugh at me when I give this answer to this question. Okay. My favorite food is tacos. It's like the most perfect, like you can put an entire meal in a tortilla, and one, it can be portable. 2, you can put anything in it. And I grew up eating them, but it's definitely, it's going to be tacos. It's easy for me.
Oh, that's so awesome. They're easy to make. You can do it on the fly and take it with you. Yes, totally.
And I don't care what's in it. You can put anything in it.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much for making a mark in the food world and in the communities that you support with the food that you provide them. So, and actually the action that you provide to creating those community relationships. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Tracy. I appreciate this a lot.
You're welcome. And everybody, thank you for tuning in and listening. I will post actually all of Jamie's contact information on how to get a hold of her if you want to reach out to her in San Antonio. And definitely tune in next week. We actually have 9 other women that are going to interview this month They aren't all going to be on Wednesdays, but I'll let you know when they are. And until next time, stay safe and eat well. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.